The winter air in New York City cut sharply through the streets, wrapping Fifth Avenue in a cold that made people walk faster and look down. Yellow taxis rushed past like streaks of light, and the glow from luxury stores reflected off the wet pavement. Richard Hayes stepped out of his black luxury car, adjusting his tailored coat. He was a self-made millionaire, known for his sharp tongue, public confidence, and habit of turning everything into a challenge. To him, the city was a playground he had already conquered. Near the sidewalk entrance to Central Park, a young street vendor stood quietly. He couldn't have been more than 25. His worn jacket was thin, his shoes old, but his posture was straight. In his hands was a small basket filled with fresh red roses, carefully arranged despite the cold. He had been standing there for hours, hoping to sell a few flowers before night fully took over. "Roses, sir?" the young man asked softly as Richard passed by. Richard stopped. He looked the vendor up and down, noticing the accent, the tired eyes, and the way the man clutched the basket as if it were something precious. A slow smile crept across Richard's face, not a kind one, but the smile of someone who believed he held power. "You think anyone here wants street roses?" Richard said loudly, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. "This isn't a charity corner." The young man lowered his gaze politely. "I'm just trying to work, sir." That calm reply amused Richard even more. He had dealt with executives, politicians, and rivals, but something about this quiet confidence bothered him. On impulse, fueled by ego and the small audience forming nearby, Richard decided to turn the moment into entertainment. "All right," he said, pulling out his phone as if already bored. "Sell me these roses in Arabic, and I'll pay you $100,000. A few people laughed, others stopped walking, curious. It sounded like a joke, the kind rich men made when they wanted to remind others of the gap between them. Richard was certain the vendor would stutter, maybe smile awkwardly, or walk away in embarrassment. The young man froze, not in fear, but in surprise. Arabic. For a brief second, the noise of the city faded in his mind. He remembered a small apartment far from New York. He remembered his mother sitting near a window, teaching him words slowly, carefully, telling him that language carried honor and history. He remembered promises made to survive, to work, to never beg. He looked up. Richard expected confusion. Instead, he saw something else in the vendor's eyes: focus, restraint, and a quiet strength. The young man tightened his grip on the basket of roses, as if grounding himself. The crowd waited. Richard smirked, confident. To him, this was already over. But the young vendor took a slow breath, lifted his head, and prepared to speak, setting the stage for a moment that would soon silence the street and change everything. The young vendor stood still for a moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Then, in a clear and steady voice, he began to speak in Arabic. His words flowed smoothly, rich with emotion and rhythm, as if they carried years of memory within them. The sound of the language cut through the noise of the city, rising above car horns and hurried footsteps. One by one, people stopped walking. Conversations faded. Even the wind seemed to listen. Richard's confident smile slowly weakened. He had expected broken phrases or silence, not this. The vendor's tone was respectful yet powerful, speaking of roses as symbols of mercy, patience, and dignity. He described how a rose grows among thorns, just as a person grows stronger through hardship. Though many in the crowd didn't understand Arabic, they felt the meaning in his voice. When the vendor finished, silence hung in the air. Then he calmly translated his words into English. "These roses," he said, lifting the basket slightly, "are not sold by color or price alone. They are sold with respect. A rose offered with humility is worth more than gold offered with pride." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Phones were raised. Someone whispered, "That was beautiful." Richard felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control of the moment. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his usual confidence, but the words didn't come easily. The people around him were no longer watching for amusement, they were watching for truth. "Where did you learn that?" Richard asked, his voice lower now. "My mother," the vendor replied simply. "She taught me before I lost her. She said language is not for showing off. It's for remembering who you are." That answer struck harder than any insult could have. Richard looked around at the faces surrounding him. Students, tourists, office workers, all witnessing his challenge turn into a lesson. He reached into his coat and slowly took out his wallet, counting the money carefully, exactly as he had promised. When he handed over the payment, the vendor hesitated. "I didn't speak for money," he said quietly. "But I will accept it, for my future." Richard nodded, unable to meet his eyes for long. The transaction was completed, but something deeper had already shifted. Applause broke out, soft at first, then stronger. The street that had once echoed with laughter now carried respect. The vendor thanked the crowd with a gentle nod, handed a rose to a nearby child, and walked away into the city lights. Richard remained standing, frozen in place, realizing that wealth could buy many things, but not the dignity he had just witnessed. That night, the city remembered the roses. Richard Hayes stood alone on the sidewalk long after the crowd began to thin. The city slowly returned to its usual rhythm, cars honking, people rushing, laughter echoing from nearby cafes, but something inside him had shifted. The applause still rang faintly in his ears, not as praise, but as a reminder. For the first time in years, he felt exposed. Not because he had lost money, but because he had revealed a part of himself he rarely confronted, his arrogance. He looked down at his empty hand, where his wallet had been moments ago. $100,000 meant little to him in numbers, yet the moment had cost him something far more valuable. The young vendor's words replayed in his mind, especially the line about pride and humility. Richard had built his empire on confidence, risk, and dominance, but tonight had shown him the quiet power of dignity. Across the street, the vendor walked toward a subway entrance, the basket now lighter but his steps steady. He did not run. He did not celebrate. Instead, he moved with calm purpose, as if this moment was just another step forward. Inside his mind, however, emotions stirred. He thought of the long nights working double shifts, the language barriers, and the promise he had made to himself to rise without losing respect. The money would change his circumstances, yes, but the respect he had earned mattered more. Richard surprised himself by calling out, "Wait." The vendor stopped and turned. "I owe you an apology," Richard said, his voice firm but sincere. "I spoke to you as if you were less than me. You proved me wrong." The vendor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Respect doesn't need apologies," he replied. "It needs understanding." Those words settled deeply. Richard extended his hand. This time, it wasn't a challenge, it was a gesture of equality. The vendor shook it briefly, then offered him a rose from the basket. "For remembering," the vendor said. Richard accepted it. The rose felt fragile in his hand, yet meaningful. As the vendor disappeared into the subway, Richard stood there, holding the flower like a symbol of a lesson he wouldn't forget. Days later, the video of the incident spread across social media. Millions watched as the millionaire's mockery turned into silence, then humility. Comment sections filled with praise for the vendor's grace and criticism of arrogance. Richard didn't try to erase it. Instead, he shared the video himself with a simple caption, "Respect is priceless." The vendor's life changed, too. Opportunities followed. Education, stability, and a future he had once only imagined. Yet he continued to sell roses, not out of need, but by choice. Each rose carried a story, a memory, and a reminder that true wealth lies not in what you own, but in how you treat others. And in the heart of New York City, a single moment between a millionaire and a rose seller became a quiet legend, one that taught thousands the value of humility, language, and human dignity.